This video presents a philosophy of power. What is power? Is power inherently good or evil? Power is the animating force of life, a fundamental striving that runs through all living things, and our moral task is to establish a virtuous relationship with it. When power is repressed and denied, it leads to resentment and sickness, and when it is unleashed without restraint, it leads to violence and self-destruction. I believe those who fail to integrate power are spiteful toads and woke cry-bullies, and those who unleash power without restraint are blonde beasts and rage monsters. Between these extremes lies a golden mean, a virtue between two vices, where power is integrated and harmonized, resulting in self-mastery and vitality. This is the domain of heroes and paragons. Come with me now to learn how properly integrating power leads to self-mastery and vitality. The world is the will to power, and nothing besides. Friedrich Nietzsche placed power at the center of his metaphysics, ethics, and psychology. The will to power, his all-encompassing thesis that explains everything from cosmology to biological life, to human psychology, and even politics. Nietzsche arrived at this idea by contrast to other theories of motivation. He considered Schopenhauer's will a ceaseless striving force underlying all reality, manifesting as the will to live in humans and animals. For Nietzsche, Schopenhauer's will was too passive. Likewise, he was unconvinced by the utilitarian idea that humans innately seek to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. The cosmos needed something more assertive and noble to explain itself. Nietzsche proclaimed the will to power. The will to power is a star shining ever more brightly until violently exploding in a supernova, a tree growing taller into the sunlight rising high above the canopy, or a human being summiting a tall mountain even if it costs them their life. It's the innate impulse to expand and grow, overcome resistance, become stronger, achieve self-overcoming, and create value. For Nietzsche, the will to power operated at all levels of analysis, as the cosmic principle behind the interplay of physical forces, as the psychological impulse behind every human instinct from fear to creativity, and as the underlying motivation for morality and culture. Power as an omnipresent, natural expression of reality itself, not inherently good or evil, but tending to produce two value systems in humans: master morality and slave morality. Master morality is created by powerful individuals who value strength, pride, health, courage, creativity, self-affirmation, and glory. Slave morality is a reaction to master morality by the oppressed, who value compassion, kindness, equality, humility, safety, community, and salvation. Master and slave morality tend to follow a Pareto distribution, or 80-20 rule, where 80% of the power concentrates among 20% of the population, which is aptly known as a power law. Pareto distributions pop up all over the place, such as wealth distribution in human societies, mating opportunity in prides of lions, sunlight access in forest canopies, and stellar mass and luminosity in the observable universe. It really is a fascinating pattern if you want to look deeper into this yourself, and it lends weight to the idea that Nietzsche might have been onto something with power as the most general resource of allocation across the universe. It's impossible to say if the world truly is the will to power and nothing besides. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume the will to power exists and its distribution follows a power law. Next, let's explore how our relationship with power can become distorted either in excess or deficiency, both leading to suffering, while there is a virtuous golden mean of power that leads to flourishing. Aristotle regarded virtue as a golden mean between two extremes of excess and deficiency. I believe our relationship with power fits into a framework of a golden mean between two extremes. Power is the raw driving force. It permeates through us and animates us. An excess of power flowing through us without moral restraint or prudence leads to mania, violence, and self-destruction. The pursuit of power begins early in life. Alfred Adler, an Austrian psychologist and successor to Sigmund Freud, proposed an innate drive among humans he called striving for superiority, a manifestation of Nietzsche's will to power in psychological form. According to Adler, everyone experiences inferiority in childhood. Children are small, dependent, and have less power than adults. To compensate, individuals mature and develop skills and capabilities to make up for their perceived inferiority. However, if the feelings of inferiority are not overcome, an overcompensation can occur, producing a superiority complex where the individual becomes preoccupied with a feeling of power, displaying arrogance or aggression to cover a feeling of weakness. For Adler, power was a natural and necessary impulse for personal growth and confidence, but if pursued in excess, it led to distortions and exaggerations of the ego. Nietzsche was well aware of the excesses of power. A master morality describes a group of individuals who affirm themselves. They say yes to their instincts and create values that celebrate their own excellence, vitality, and superiority. However, master morality requires self-regulation or self-overcoming to channel the instincts into nobility, creativity, or genius, like the Roman aristocrats, Renaissance artists, or Enlightenment scientists respectively. When unregulated, master morality goes nuclear and loses its creative, life-affirming quality, resulting in amorality and tyranny. Niccolo Machiavelli infamously advised that in order to attain and preserve power, rulers must be prepared to act against virtue, to be cunning like a fox or ferocious like a lion. One of his most frequently cited quotes is that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. Placing the goal of acquiring power and maintaining it above all else will require immoral means, such as lying, breaking promises, and even assassinations. Machiavellian power, where the ends justify the means, can therefore be understood as amoral power because it values pragmatism and expedience above morality and virtue. Valuing the acquisition and maintenance of power above morality and virtue will be effective and maybe even necessary in power-dominated arenas like politics and war, but ultimately, without morality's guiding hand, it would lead to megalomania and monsters. A concept familiar to the ancient Greeks was mania, literal translation, madness, a visceral state of self-indulgent loss of self-control that brings about violence and destruction, and ultimately, self-destruction. Various cultures have captured mania in literature and media as the rage monster archetype, a recurring motif of a man becoming blind with rage, sometimes completely split from his personality. The original example, Heracles, symbol of strength and power in Greek mythology, Hercules for the Romans, is driven temporarily insane by the vengeful goddess Hera. In his mania, Heracles kills his own wife and children. Tragic irony. The strongest man on earth destroying what is most vulnerable and precious to him. Great strength and a lack of self-control. In European folklore, lycanthrope, when a man is cursed to transform into a werewolf on the full moon, losing rationality and committing bloodthirsty killings in that state. Werewolves are a metaphor for the savage power lurking in human nature. Transformation into a werewolf is a moral lesson that unleashing savage power costs a man his humanity. Give in to the animal and give up your humanity. In Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll creates a serum that temporarily separates his moral self from his evil self, creating a split personality called Mr. Hyde. Although smaller than Dr. Jekyll in stature, Mr. Hyde is endowed with ape-like strength and brutality like a psychopathic chimpanzee. Dr. Jekyll willingly drinks the serum, unleashing Mr. Hyde on the slums of London, initially because he enjoys the liberation from his conscience and the thrill of unrestrained power. However, Mr. Hyde's power begins to grow, unchecked by morality or restraint, fueling increasingly atrocious acts and leading to the corruption of Dr. Jekyll's soul. In the end, to stop Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll must die. Power without a conscience results in self-destruction. Perhaps most familiar to modern audiences is Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's Incredible Hulk, a hulking green rage monster. After being exposed to gamma radiation from a gamma bomb of his own design, Dr. Bruce Banner transforms into the Hulk whenever he becomes enraged or distressed. The Hulk is a green behemoth of immense strength and near invulnerability, but with a primitive, childlike intellect. The gamma bomb represents scientific overreach, Dr. Banner going beyond his limit and unleashing power he couldn't control, like Prometheus stealing fire from Zeus, or Icarus flying too close to the sun. Hulk storylines often involve Hulk raging out and causing unintended destruction, sometimes unable to distinguish friend from foe. Hulk can be a superhero when aimed at villains, but more often than not, Hulk is a major liability to Bruce Banner and the people around him. You wouldn't like power when it's angry. Finally, the Dragon Ball anime also makes several references to the volatility and destabilizing effect of overwhelming power. The legend of the first Super Saiyan tells of a warrior so powerful he had to remain in his great ape Uzaru form to contain his power. His rage burned so intensely that it eventually consumed him, and in the end he was destroyed by his own power. And Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan, whose eyes and mouth tear as his ki explodes out of him. When Goku delivers the killing blow, Broly doesn't just die, he appears to explode, bursting at the seams with power. The stronger fighter is not necessarily the fighter with the highest power level. This is part of it. It's the fighter who is able to wield their power the best, and that requires skill, efficiency, and self-mastery. In Dragon Ball, tremendous power without control can literally tear the user's body apart. The moral of these stories is that unrestrained power can be a loose cannon at best, and catastrophically violent and self-destructive at worst. They make us aware that we should be more vigilant of violence from within than violence from without. As we know, if you're a man, particularly a powerful man, it is more likely that your family is harmed by your violence than the violence of someone else, like Heracles killing his wife and child, destroying what is most precious to him. Violence is a vice, and vice is far more common than victimization in my opinion. And even if you are the victim of violence, there is no doubt that vice, whether it's vengeful violence or the ensuring self-destruction, can make it infinitely worse. Hannah Arendt argued that power and violence are opposites, because in her view power is defined by legitimacy and consent, while violence is defined by destruction and force. Thus, where there is violence, power is operating in a vicious and destructive way. She is logically correct in that where there is vice, virtue is not, and where there is virtue, vice is not. Therefore, the vice of excess in relation to power is violence and self-destruction. So much for the excesses of power. If an excessive relationship with power is the vice of violence and self-destruction, then a deficient relationship must surely be the vice of resentment and sickness. Let's walk it through. When Alfred Adler's striving for superiority goes unheeded, and the individual is unable to develop skills, competence, and confidence, they can develop an inferiority complex. This is a state of internalized powerlessness, a subjective feeling of being less than others, weak or incapable, and often lacking the courage or agency to act. They may avoid challenges, fearing failure, shrink from social comparisons, and harbour secret self-contempt. In Adler's view, such individuals may mask these painful feelings through various protective strategies. Adler identified safeguarding tendency, where the individual will find excuses to avoid confronting their lack of achievement or power. For instance, someone who feels they cannot succeed might adopt a philosophy of not trying to feel morally superior. I'm above competition, or I'm poor, but at least I'm not greedy. This stance towards power can coalesce at the collective level into Nietzsche's slave morality, a morality forged by those who have little power as a reaction to those with great power. Nietzsche's thesis is that slave morality is the result of a slave revolt against morality itself, when the weak, unable to physically overcome the strong, instead redefine the very concept of good and evil in a way which favours their own condition. Resentful, those with less power gain cultural influence via a transvaluation of values. The traits of powerlessness become sanctified, lack of outward success becomes humility, lack of material wealth becomes modesty and charity, serving someone you despise becomes obedience, and suffering without overcoming is seen as noble and courageous. Likewise, aristocratic traits of the powerful are inverted as vices. Pride becomes a sin, strength becomes dangerous, success becomes unearned privilege and exploitation, wealth becomes greed, and so on. The emotional drive behind this moral jujitsu is resentment, literally a reaction to the sentiment of the powerful, a deep resentment, bitterness, and hatred of the powerful. Lacking the direct means to avenge themselves, the weak must wage a moral and cultural war that recasts their weakness as a choice and a virtue. The last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor. Eat the rich. Nietzsche believed many philosophies and religions were really just slave moralities in disguise. The two most famous targets of Nietzsche's wrath were Christianity and Buddhism. Christianity because of its condemnation that we live in a fallen world, born into sin, and to be saved in an afterlife if we repent for our very nature, which Nietzsche saw as healthy and spirited. Buddhism because of its aversion to suffering and renunciation of worldly attachment, seeking refuge inwardly and liberation from samsara, the cycle of birth and death, nirvana upon death. Both fundamentally pessimistic in their assessment of the conditions of life, both turning away, elevating death and denying the primacy of this life on earth in favour of the promise of transcendence. To the astute listeners in my audience, the connection to various contemporary ideologies is not difficult to make. Karl Marx's revolutionary socialism is fundamentally the doctrine of empowering the powerless, the proletariat, and overthrowing the powerful, the bourgeoisie. In Marx's theory, the working class are exploited and alienated from the output of their labour under capitalism. They are deprived of economic power and by extension political and cultural power. Marxism frames this as a moral and historical injustice, a class war between the virtuous, suffering proletariat and the decadent, parasitic bourgeoisie. Justice and morality demands a reversal where the last become first. Sound familiar? Resentment is encouraged, and revolt and violence justified and glorified. Contemporary identity politics, or perhaps the new pejorative woke politics, is often described as neo-Marxism. It utilizes a similar oppressor versus oppressed, i.e., powerless versus powerful narrative, exalting the traits and values of the oppressed, in this case, sex, race, gender, and sexuality, interestingly not poverty, and denigrating the traits and values of the privileged, stereotypically the straight white male, without condemning or condoning the categorization and evaluation of human beings based on their sex, race, gender, and sexuality. The end result is undoubtedly the same, a morality of resentment and a moral imperative to overthrow the powerful. What may begin as the attempt to elevate the downtrodden, increase empathy and inclusion, and rectify inequities can easily putrefy into a sort of reverse authoritarianism where individuals are overthrown or silenced purely due to their economic status as with Marxism, or their group identity as with wokeism, stripping people of their status as an individual. A necessary component of a convincing slave morality is the valorization of victimhood. This creates an incentive to interpret events in the most victimizing way possible in order to claim the moral high ground. Factors that predict identification with victimhood are the need for recognition, which means the motivation to have one's victimhood acknowledged, moral elitism, which is the perception of immaculate morality of the self and absolute immorality of the other, a lack of empathy, which means an oblivious reaction to the suffering of others, and rumination, a preoccupation with one's distress and its possible causes, rather than its possible solutions. If you'd like to hear more about victimhood and its consequences, check out my video, The Case Against Victimhood. The result is a culture that infantilizes its population, valorizes weakness and victimhood, seeks to cut down its highest achievers, and yearns for salvation and liberation, ultimately through death. Truly self-loathing, resentful, misanthropic, antinatalist, and suicidal, a moral warning that true victimization comes from within, not without, a mirror to the earlier threat of violence coming from within rather than without. The vice of a deficiency of power is cultural sickness, decay, and death. What happens when an individual is able to harness and integrate power, to allow the power to flow through them, aiming it inwardly and using it to overcome their weakness and generate creative output? Nietzsche introduced us to the Übermensch, his idealized human being. Central to the Übermensch is his relationship with the will to power. An Übermensch is described as an individual overflowing with health, who has overcome themselves and integrated their instincts to become a generative, life-giving force. The Übermensch does not become undone by an excessive or deficient relationship with power like his monstrous and resentful counterparts. The key insights of excess and deficiency in this video is that violence comes from within rather than without, and victimization comes from within rather than without. Accordingly, it is self-mastery from within that governs the virtuous relationship with power, aiming strength inwardly to conquer the vices of excess such as hubris, arrogance, superiority, mania, and violence, and the vices of deficiency such as resentment, self-loathing, inferiority, and sickness. In the pages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes 3 metamorphoses. They are, first, turning into a camel, learning to bear burdens, and to do so with humility. Then a lion, rejecting external masters and cultivating personal agency. And finally, a child, achieving the freedom to play with life and create new values. In their fullness, Übermensch is beyond both master and slave moralities, neither consumed by power nor resentful of it, but rather healthy and playful, allowing power to flow through themselves and create new things. Similarly, Aristotle describes the megalopsychos as the magnanimous individual, literally great-souled, one who has brought about virtue in themselves, and upon cultivating that virtue considers themselves worthy of honour and greatness, a kind of self-recognition, but only after cultivating Aristotle's 11 other virtues. Similar to the Übermensch, Aristotle makes it clear that megalopsychia, or magnanimity, is a final stage for the virtuous man, and occurs only after one has achieved self-mastery. Power is allowed to flow freely once the impulses and instincts have been brought under voluntary control. This makes the megalopsychos powerful, yet wise and prudent, slow to anger and not given to boasting, generous and willing to help others from a position of strength, and able to exercise authority gracefully, knowing when to be firm and when to be lenient. Magnanimity is closely paired with another chief virtue for the Greek philosophers, justice, or proportionality, giving to each person and each situation its due, neither overreacting nor underreacting. This is an important contrast to rage monsters of excess, who are especially prone to overreacting and causing violence and destruction, and spiteful toads of deficiency who play victim and tear down the objects of their resentment. Given the will to power is the underlying force behind reality, this relationship with power could be considered a kind of harmony with that force. In Taoism, Dai is considered the virtue of living in accordance with the Tao. Sometimes translated as naturalness, the emphasis on alignment with the way nature is, nature being Tao, another flowing, striving force giving rise to all things. A degree of Dai, or naturalness, is essential to a virtuous relationship to power. We cannot achieve virtue by stifling power's life-giving and generative effects, as that leads to deficiency and sickness. And likewise, we cannot grasp and go drunk with power, as that leads to excess and violence. If power is the animating force of life, it is our job to live in harmony with it, saying yes to life, and noticing the striving of life to flourish and overcome itself. Cultivating virtue in this realm is the practice of becoming attuned. Self-mastery is about becoming a hospitable environment and finely tuned conduit for the underlying power of nature to flow through you. I've always admired the way Dragon Ball has depicted power. Warriors attain power by cultivating ki, life energy, similar to the traditional Chinese concept of qi. Super Saiyan is initially triggered by intense rage and grief, forcing an increase in ki and power. But the emotional-driven power-up generally narrows the mind and draws great life force from the user. If sustained for long periods, it can also tear the user apart, as described earlier. The real trick to mastering Super Saiyan and Ki is calm and control. Goku teaches this to Gohan in the hyperbolic time chamber in their preparation for the battle against Cell. By spending time as a Super Saiyan in a state of inner peace and calm, they tame the transformation and bring their Ki into harmony where it is much more efficient to access and use. The idea is that rage and grief do not drive the highest power level, nor is having the highest power level in the body effective in battle. Trunks tries this and ends up muscle-bound and overloaded with Ki, unable to move swiftly and endure the fight. Rather, it is to achieve harmony with your Ki and make power effortlessly flow through you that creates the strongest fighter. Goku's ultimate form, Ultra Instinct, is a literal embodiment of effortless action, a concept taken straight out of the pages of the Tao Te Ching. In this state, Goku's movements are perfectly efficient and do not require conscious force, as he reacts without thought and naturally, as water flowing downhill. The philosophical implication is that the state of maximal power is the state of maximal flow, achieved only through complete self-mastery and harmony. Power is the animating force of life. It is the luminosity of stars, the growth of trees, and the impulse in human beings to overcome, create, and become more than what they were. The question is not whether power is good or bad. Power simply is. The real question is how we relate to it. When power is repressed and moralized, it decays into resentment and sickness. When power is indulged without restraint or morality, it corrupts into mania and violence. Between these two extremes of deficiency and excess lies the golden mean, a virtuous relationship where power is integrated into self-mastery. Nietzsche's Übermensch, Aristotle's megalopsychos, and Taoist Day all point to the same message. The highest power is integrated power. Power aimed inwardly and brought into harmony creates heroes, great souled individuals, and masters of Ki. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about cultivating virtue and living in harmony, consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching.